There were 2 people trained in forestry here in our faculty when I came here. I was the 3rd. I was able to bring in some good students, show the faculty that we could bring in good students, then we were able to bring in additional faculty. One of the first things I told them was that, look, you're coming in here, it's a brand new program, we've just gotten accredited, and what you need to do from here on is make me look good. And they did.
Timing was right. It was the beginning of the environmental movement, clean water, clean air, and that was very important. Also, you gotta look at Dr. Hosner. He was a bold leader. He was a mover. He was a shaker. He could convince anybody of almost anything.
We have just really gotten started. So we're right there with competing with the best of them from a very, very minor start. Well, if you stop to think about it, we've come a hell of a long way.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Saskia Vandegevel, and I'm Dean of the College of Natural Resources and Environment. I want to start by welcoming you to the John F. Hosner Distinguished Lecture. We are so honored to honor John F. Hosner as the founding dean, and we want to especially thank Tina Hosner. Tina, if you don't mind standing up, for this generous gift of this lecture for our faculty. This is a lasting legacy that will impact our college for generations. What John was able to do is bring in exceptional talent and recognize the importance of investing in generations of students to come in natural resources. So thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank other people that are here, including alum. If you are an alumni of the College of Natural Resources and Environment, please raise your hands. Wow, that's great. They're mostly lumped over here on the right side, but they can also spread, right? We also have retired faculty, current faculty and students. We have 186 people here tonight. Okay, that's exceptional. And thank you all for being here. We also want to thank members of the New River Valley community, as well as people who've traveled, Wayne and his son from North Carolina, including natural history experts. Where is Terry Lasher? No, you're not in trouble yet. And so Terry is our newly appointed state forester from the governor's office. So thank you so much for being here, Terry. Terry was one of the very first people to welcome me as dean, and I really appreciate that generosity of spirit. So let's talk about Dave Stahle for a second. Dave is very fancy. He's a fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, so AAAS. He's widely featured by the National Science Foundation, National Geographic Stories, NOAA, and the Smithsonian. And as a scientist, his publications have been cited over 16,000 times. So we are very honored to have you here, Dave. As a dendrochronologist, his pioneering research using tree rings reveal centuries of climate history, all the way from even millennia with bald cypress, but you've done work all over the world, most extensively in North America. You're working in the Amazon basin now in Brazil. You've done work in Zambia, Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa. And so I'm excited to hear about all of it, but not just using tree rings to look at climate most recently, but reconstructing climate and drought on a continental scale. So thank you. I also want to make sure you understand the impact he's had on citizen scientists. So The work that Dave Stahle has done on the Black River in North Carolina is on nature conservancy property. And you spend a lot of time sharing your knowledge to the general public, not just to the scientific community. And I think that translates to a lot of people here in this room because they're here because everyone loves to hear about old trees, right? And the stories they tell. So I've been fortunate to know Dave 20 years. We met in Beijing and had dinner with a group of tree ring scientists in the Forbidden City. And then later I went on to marry his grad student, Mark Spond. And for our wedding present, Dave wasn't able to come to our wedding, but he ended up sending a check to me. And it was just to me, not to Mark. And it said, to Saskia Van de Gevel. And in the memo line, it said, for marrying Mark Spond. And, and I love that because it's the only check I've ever gotten for marrying my husband. Um, but if you do want to write a check to support our college, you can see Andrew. He's by the door and he introduced us. But I've loved having a friendly relationship with Dave, and he's a mentor to so many generations of tree ring scientists and people around the world as a champion for science and understanding the importance of preserving old trees. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Dave Stahle.
Let's see. Oh, that's amazing. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm very honored to be here, and I'm not kidding. This is an extreme honor for me. I get to speak about old trees today. I get to explain dendrochronology and how it works and how we use it to reconstruct climate variability and climate change in time and across space. I get to talk about our research in, well, the southeastern United States and here in Virginia and also in Mexico. It's been a while since I've been down there, but we found some incredible things working with colleagues in Mexico. And then recently in Amazonia. And so I get to talk about all of that in 45 minutes. I'm going to hurry through this. And so we're going to dim the lights, I hope, and go full screen here. Let's see. Already are full screen. I'm on full screen. Oh, well, can you see the cursor? Where's the cursor? You see the cursor here? Yeah. You see Jose Villanueva Diaz right there. That's my buddy in Mexico. He works for the INIFOP, which is the Mexican Forest Service, and we're coring millenarios, los millenarios at Barranca de Amialco in Querétaro, 90 miles from Teotihuacan, you know, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon. Big time, excellent climate record there. I get to talk about that today. Here is an ancient Druid post oak in Carmel Valley, California, where the beautiful people live and the beautiful trees as well. I mean, just incredible climate records in these ancient oaks that can live for 600 years. So I'm not going to talk too much about California today, but this is what we're talking about, old trees and dendrochronology. And so this is dendrochronology. It is the most accurate and precise dating method in geochronology. It is exact to the calendar year in which the annual increments are formed without error, and we can prove it and have proven it many, many times with blind dating tests and many other methods. And so what we're looking at is a cross-section of a bald cypress, Taxodium distichum, from Blackwater River, Virginia, near Zuni. Who knows of Zuni, Virginia? Get out of here. Really? And of course, that's a mispronunciation of Zuni, which is a Puebloan group just south of Gallup, New Mexico, in western New Mexico. But I don't know where that name came from, but it is a nature conservancy preserve. And it has some, 600 to 1,000 year old trees still present there right across the James River from Jamestown. And so, this is a cross section of a piece of dead wood, a log, and we took the chainsaw to. We don't kill trees. We core them with the Swedish increment bore, 5 millimeter diameter. Doesn't harm them too bad. They can generally tolerate it, but we can date the wood on the forest floor too. And so this is exactly the pith here. The center ring is exactly 1531 without air. And you can just barely make out the needle marks: 1540, 50, 60, 70, 1580, 1590, 1600. And you see right here, 1587. That's the driest year in the Tidewater region of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina in 800 years. So say the tree rings, not just at Blackwater River, Virginia, but other sites in the region. And of course, this is a famous year, because that's the year that Virginia Dare disappeared from history, in the mystery of the lost colony. And so this turned out to be the driest single year, 1587. That is the year that the ship returned to England and the colonists were never heard from again. And the 3-year sequence, 1587 to 89, driest 3 years in also 800 years in the Tidewater region. And then there was also the Jamestown drought, the first successful colony in the New World, which kind of maxed out in 1610, the starving time when they're eating their dead. So we published an article in Science Magazine in 1998, and it made the front page in the New York Times, a news article about it. And I always say it was a slow news day. Not much was happening in the world, but it was good for us. And so how does this work? This is a piece of dead wood here, right? And so we count the rings, but that's the kindergarten of dendrochronology. Graduate school in dendrochronology is pattern matching, cross synchronization of the ring width patterns back in time from the outermost ring on living trees, which is our datum in time. You are not a dendrochronologist if upon taking the sample and placing it in the core, you do not write the identification number and the date of collection, because that is the starting point for chronology. And the way chronology works is that climate imprints on growth. Now, it imprints on growth at some forest sites better than others, but the reality is it is the dominant environmental factor modulating growth at many forest sites all over the world. And so the sequence, the annual sequence of drought years and wet years is encoded by narrow rings and fat rings. And climate is a unique, non-repetitive process. It's not predictable in time. We're getting some predictability associated with ocean atmospheric variability, most notably El Nino, Southern Oscillation, and so forth. But generally, it's kind of a random process. And so this imprinting on growth, if you have like 50 years or more of tree growth, that's a unique history of climate that's not duplicated in any other 50-year series. And so we can date the deadwood too, because we establish calendar year dating from the outermost ring on living trees, and then we do a lot of trees. It's not just one tree. Well, typically at Blackwater River, we have like 70 trees and maybe 10 or 15 logs that have all been cross-dated together with dendrochronology, mashed in time. Then we measure the rings with micron scale precision, and we get these time series, and we filter the living daylights out of the time series, and I'll show you some. But we get these patterns, these master chronologies, and we can take deadwood and we can look at its ring sequence, measure or plot its ring sequence, and consider all possible matches. And if it matches, there'll only be one place where it really matches, and we can establish dating. And so we've done this in blind dating tests. People have brought the field, pieces of wood, they know when it lived, they know when it died, we don't, we date it, we're right. We prove the accuracy of dendrochronology every time we calibrate with an instrumental record of precipitation, because that is exactly dated in time. We prove it with, coronal mass ejections from the sun that have spiked the radiocarbon content of the atmosphere. And if you radiocarbon date individual years, which the science has now done for over 1,000 years, you get these Miyake events. And all over the world, it synchronizes. Radiocarbon went up orders of magnitude. And all the tree ring chronologies that date back to that time all have it in the same year. It's exact. I mean, it's amazing. So that's dendrochronology, tree ring dating, the most accurate and precise in geochronology. It's the imprinted climate we massively replicate. Then we can directly calibrate with our time series. We can take instrumental rainfall data and compare it year by year in the modern instrumental era and calibrate it mathematically with the tree ring record, and then we can retrodict based on this statistical association between tree growth and, say, rainfall in the modern era. We can estimate what rainfall would have been like in the pre-modern era, the pre-instrumental era. That's called calibration. And then we validate our reconstructions on withheld data. Maybe we hold back the first 50 years of instrumental rainfall data to test the calibration with. And then, of course, we test it with known events in history. And there's many other ways to do it. Generally, most of the mid-latitude trees are responsive to soil moisture, which is driven by precipitation and temperature. And so the growing season moisture balance in the soil is what generally most of these trees, are correlated with. They're not perfectly correlated, but some are darn near. Like blue oak in the foothills of California, 0.9, can explain over 80% of the variance in rainfall in the wet season in one of the most water-dependent parts of the United States and around the world. And so they don't tend to tell us about how much it rained on December 31st. I mean, it's not single events. They tend to integrate, so we call them integrating pluviometers, integrating rain gauges. And again, we don't cut trees. So one more little show of tree rings here. Why do we study them? Well, for exact archaeological dating, we can date historical buildings. We calibrated the most important dating method in the world, which is certainly radiocarbon dating. That's good for the last 50,000 years. Tree rings cover maybe the last 10,000 years at most. But radiocarbon dating made certain assumptions about the production rate of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. It turned out to be incorrect. And we've been able to correct it by dating with radiocarbon tree ring dated bits of wood. And so we can calibrate radiocarbon age against true age using tree rings. Super important, and radiocarbon has, of course, been used to date the development of civilization around the world. It's widely used to study, environmental change in the glacial, post-glacial period. Super important method. We use tree rings to reconstruct climate variability and climate change, reconstruct other environmental events and changes like wildfire events, or the cessation of wildfire in natural forests due to human activity sometimes, or earthquake activity, volcanic eruptions. And we used dendrochronology to authenticate ancient forests, to help document ecological integrity and to help save the planet, and it's need and saving. And so here is a photomicrograph taken by Dan Griffin of post-oak rings. And you can see here, I've tick marked the annual boundaries down here. This big ghastly hole in the medullary ray is a needle mark, just a real sharp little needle mark. And at 1780, the year 1780 is right here. If you can see my cursor, 81, 82. So the annual ring is a couplet of early wood and these large diameter vessel elements, this circular, that's the spring wood or the early wood. And then this gigantic ring in 1783 with the dense fiber cells of the late wood. And oftentimes the annual ring is demarcated by a fine line of marginal or so-called terminal parenchyma. So early wood, late wood, together they constitute one annual ring. And it's possible to separately analyze early wood and late wood and get separate seasonal reconstructions, not just the whole. We do the whole ring. We do the early ring, the late ring. We do mainly ring width. It's hard to improve on it. In blue oak and post oak in Texas, it's so strong already, it's hard to improve on. But we also do densitometric analysis of the wood. That can be outstandingly good, especially for temperature reconstructions in the far north or high alpine forest. We do stable isotope analyses, and we're really just beginning. But the key thing is exact dating in time, thanks to dendrochronology. That anytime you have a proxy or a natural system that counts time and extends the observational record deep into prehistory, that is valuable. And so how does it work? This is are you guys seeing that? That's not good that we're having, you guys see, this is really on full screen. Is that, that's sorry. This is site selection. And this is an important principle. Like this is the Standard dendroclimatic theory is what we say, site selection. It's also called the environmental mediation of climate signal and tree growth. Turns out all tree species are not equally valuable for dendroclimatology. We practice site selection to sample forest environments where the climate influence on growth is maximized. And so that's what this is fundamentally illustrating. The difference between a complacent site on the left and a sensitive site on the right. This would be, say, ponderosa pine in Oregon, and you can see that tree at the left. It's a tall, handsome, full-grown tree. It's growing on a level site, perhaps near a lake or a stream. It's got abundant soil moisture. I mean, it's loving it. It's got outstanding tree growth conditions, but if you take a core sample, the other rings are somewhat indifferent. They're about the same size from year to year. We refer to these as complacent. You can count the rings. You can determine approximately how old the tree is, but it's much more difficult to dendrochronologically date it and say affirmatively that is indeed the year 1801. Compare that to the tree on the right, which is grown on a steep, dry site, underlain by rock substrata, thin soil, dependent upon precipitation entirely for its soil moisture supply. It's conservative. It's aesthetic. It's growing in these high, dry areas. If you take a core sample from it, well, first of all, there's a lot more rings in it. And from year to year, the annual rings, remember the dark bands, count the dark bands, you're counting years, and they're highly variable. And in fact, they're highly correlated with rainfall, or even better yet, with the soil moisture index, Palmer drought severity index, for example. And so there's all kinds of information content in that. So we discriminate between complacent growth sites and sensitive growth sites. We also note that size is often not equal to age. Look, this thing's got 7 rings in the same bit of core, length of core. This thing has 20 rings. And the growth rate is just much slower on the xeric sites. And so, sometimes giant sequoia are definitely old. So they're the biggest things in the world, right? They get really old. I think it's the 3rd oldest known living tree species in the world. 3,200 years old is the oldest yet documented giant sequoia. So these aren't universals. These are just generalizations. Size does not equal age. And then Schulman's great insight, longevity under adversity. Schulman discovered the bristlecone pine in the great age in the White Mountains of California. In fact, it's, the Edmund Schulman Visitor Center, in the White Mountains of California. And there's a trail now called Methuselah Walk. Who's been on Methuselah Walk? Come on. Now, that is a sublime experience. Does anyone refute that? That is one of the great experiences of your life. You're in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada. You're above Death Valley. It's one of the most hyper-arid forest environments in the world. These things grow painfully slowly. And there's a bunch of, they routinely get over 1,000 years old. There's many over 2,000 years old, not only in the White Mountains, but elsewhere in the high elevation forests of the Great Basin. Some over 4,000 years old. And of course, the record is 5,000, thereabouts, And Schulman realized that, wow, these things, under these adverse conditions, they really grow slowly. Same with bald cypress in the southeastern United States. It'll grow really slow on these blackwater systems that are acidic and nutrient poor. In the lower Mississippi Valley, they'll grow better and faster, but they still get old. So we make that note, longevity under adversity, and then commercial versus non-commercial forests. And this is important to me because the tree at the left, that's ideal for silviculture, scientific silviculture. You can go in, you can harvest the crop, you can bring in equipment, you can do it efficiently. You can see that the site is reseeded. The growth rate is respectable. You can expect to harvest again in a human time frame, and you can produce wood and fiber for society. It's ideal forest management site. The tree on the right, it would be folly to people cut them. They bring equipment in there and it causes erosion and, the growth rate is so slow, you're not going to get enough, it's just not a commercial site. Gifford Pinchot would not, I don't think, what little I've read about him, he knew this difference. He knew the difference. Am I wrong? He knew the difference between forest sites that are good for silviculture and those that are not. And this is what's being illustrated here. And the meaning of this is important too, because Marion Clausen wrote, he was with Resources for the Future. At one time, he was with the BLM and they fired him. But in 1979, he published an article in Science Magazine, and he estimated that pre-settlement forest cover in the lower 48 United States was 950 million acres. And he estimated about 100 million acres of that, a little bit more than 10%, was quote unquote non-commercial for lumber production. And so there are many non-commercial forests still out there that were never cut. And that's important for our work. And so they're illustrated here in this map of North American tree ring chronologies. And so they're color coded by genus. There's, in purple, there's Juniperus, Picea, Pinus hard, Pinus soft, Suditsuga, Quercus in green, Taxodium in black, and all of these, like here's the Smoky Hill River there in west central Kansas. They're hardly trees, they're little bushes, but it is Juniperus virginiana, named after Virginia. And there it is growing out. It's not scopulorum, it's virginiana. And we made a chronology there, and it's incredibly valuable. And we have about each one of these triangles, it's not one tree, it's about 30 trees each, maybe it'd be 100 trees at each triangle location. So it's not just one tree, it's a lot of trees that are all being cross-dated, all measured, all in time, and they're all over 300 years long. And so these are old growth forests all over the United States. And many of them are these non-commercial sites, such as chestnut oak, along the Blue Ridge Parkway. There's a lot of, I don't know how much, but there are old growth, 300-year-old chestnut oaks still alive along the Blue Ridge Parkway. There's other hardwood sites too, in the Appalachians. And then, of course, bald cypress, was one of the most valuable, heavily pillaged species in the southeastern United States. It was savagely logged in our history. But there are senescent, overmature sites like Black River, North Carolina. This right here is the oldest known tree in eastern North America right there. That's BLK 227. It's 2,632 years old and still counting right now. And it's not the oldest tree out there, but many of the oldest trees are partly hollow. And so this one happened to be solid, and we documented it. And this guy's probably it's equal, at least 2,000 years old. And of course, you can see that it's a level and moist site. In fact, it's ridiculously moist, and yet, so it completely contradicts standard dendroclimatic theory, which is standard. It's not universal, and it turns out there are species like Pilgerodendron uviferum, which is another deciduous conifer that grows in the wetlands in Valdivian rainforests, and kind of like cypress, and looks like cypress, and the rings look like cypress, but it's Pilgerodendron, and it cross-dates, and it also is correlated with climate and gets exceptionally old. So we've learned more. There are other environments wherein rings can be formed, they can have a response to climate, and they be useful for these kinds of studies. And then the oaks, post oak. So I've written a book recently about the cross timbers. This is the western edge of the eastern deciduous forest. You see the cursor here? Oops. As it merges with the grasslands of the southern plains, and then there's the oak woodlands of California. We love all that. So here's the chronology we built from Black River, North Carolina. It is the longest tree ring chronology in eastern North America. It dates from 605 before the Common Era, and the last ring in our sample is 2017. But the old guy is still alive. And what you're looking at in the gray line, the gray time series, are the annual values of ring width index. So this is after we've detrended and standardized the non-stationary ring width data, because trees are non-stationary in the mean and the variance both. And so you got to kind of detrend them, because the trend that's growth trend. It's not climate trend. And so the naive interpretation is, it's getting drier. And of course, that's not right. So we do have to process these time series, and this has been processed. It's a mean value function of all these indices from all these different trees. And I think there's over 120 trees in this particular chronology. And the heavy black curve is a multi-decadal variation. And then we took the outer 120 years or so out here, and we correlated the Black River tree ring chronology with spring rainfall in the PRISM gridded database. So it's I think it's a 4-kilometer gridded precipitation data based on station observations of rainfall, right? And so just interpolated across the space with fine scale. And then we correlate the chronology with every single grid point in the record, right? So there's a lot of spatial autocorrelation in the grid points right next to each other, of course. And the correlation maxes out about 0.75 right there. Well, then we took the grid point closest to Black River chronology. It is the instrumental data. And we correlated with the adjacent instrumental data. And the correlation there is 0.99 because it's an interpolated data product anyway. And so it's way better if you have the instrumental data and you correlate with the instrumental data. But the virtue of the tree rings is they're 25 centuries longer than the instrumental data. I mean, that's the point. And they're not as strongly correlated, but they show the same basic pattern. And when you get hundreds and thousands of these tree ring chronologies to do these reconstructions, you're really making it a valuable product. And so here's some proof of that. This is the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s. So it is the full decade, 1931 to 1940. And this is from the North American Drought Atlas with Ed Cook made. And this is the instrumental Palmer Drought Severity Index record right here, gridded for North America. And so this is a 0.5 degree resolution between each grid point, all based on observations, measurements with rain gauges and thermometers of temperature and precipitation input into Wayne Palmer's model to calculate soil moisture balance on a monthly basis. And then we averaged it for summer, June, July, August, right? And this is the real data. This is what really happened on the left. This is the greatest drought of the North America in the modern record. And then on the right is after we've reconstructed PDSI at every grid point from the irregularly distributed network of tree ring chronologies that I showed you for North America earlier in that color-coded genus-based map. And so, wow. And we use point-by-point principal components regression to do that. And we see, okay, it's a long story, but there's spatial fidelity in the proxy versus the real data. Proxy on the right, real data on the left. There's coast-to-coast dryness during this worst drought in American history. In fact, the tree rings say it's the worst drought since the 16th century megadrought in the last 350 years. And in fact, it was probably the first anthropogenic megadrought because the dust in the Dust Bowl mattered. All that we broke the sod. The soil dried out. The wind picked up. It lofted, it deflated the soil. It filled the atmosphere with black blizzards, and it interfered with solar radiation, and the radiation exchange with the surface, and a whole bunch of other things that acted to intensify and prolong the 1930s drought. So the 1930s drought was very arguably the first great anthropogenically modified drought. And of course, so the tree rings have fidelity. They have spatial and temporal fidelity with what we've actually observed. And their great virtue is they're centuries to millennia longer than the instrumental record. And so life is not fair, not always, as we know. So now we're going into some applications. And even the tree rings say that. And so what we're looking at here, two different styles of reconstruction. This is the Trail of Tears drought right here in the 1830s. And so using the North American seasonal precipitation atlas here, so we reconstructed precipitation from the early wood and late wood width chronologies we had, and some chronologies just correlated with winter and some are just correlated with summer. So it's a mixture of responses. And so we're seeing the gridded reconstructions of the standardized precipitation index, and brown means dry, green means wet, for 1837 in the winter. And for winter, the trees see winter as December through April, and the trees see summer as May, June, July. So it's not the astronomical seasons quite, but it's the tree seasons. And you can see that, 1837 was terrible, both winter and summer. So was 1838, winter and summer. So was 1839. And so the 5 civilized tribes were ill-fated people in the early 19th century. And the last of large-scale forced removals was of the Cherokee in 1838 and 1839. And they estimate that 4,000 Cherokee people died on the Trail of Tears. And we knew this. We knew that there was cold winter conditions they suffered in. We knew there was drought, and there was no forage on the land. The animals couldn't eat. It was terrible. People were dying. And we think it's the largest death toll in an American drought in the history of the United States. And compare that with the Sooner pluvial, so this is a 4-year pluvial. Now, this is the Summer Palmer Drought Severity Index down here. Dry is red and wet is blue, and it's for the 4-year interval. And 1889 to 1892. And on Earth Day in 1889, of course, it hadn't been invented yet, but it was Earth Day, 1889. The land rush, there was 50,000 Sooners. And Oklahoma City became a city in one day. It went from 0 to 10,000 people in one day. And these lucky settlers had four wetness for their required 5-year residence time on their property. So these people, the civilized tribes, were disenfranchised of their property and their lives in some cases. And these people got free land. And, life's not fair, right? But the Cherokee, are there. The Chickasaw are there. The Choctaw, they're all there. They survived to this day, and they benefited from the pluvial too. But darn, there's a lot of tragedy in human history, and the tree rings help tell the story, help show quantitatively, where the droughts were most intense during these regrettable translocations. So now Mexico. So I'm almost done. Well, not really. I got to do Mexico, and then I got to do Amazon. But so this is about Mexico, Montezuma bald cypress. That's Taxodium mucronatum, we have Taxodium disticum in Virginia. And this is the correlation of the Montezuma bald cypress chronology at Barranca de Amialco down here. You see the white dot in central Mexico. And we correlated it with the 0.5 degree gridded Palmer Drought Severity Index for June. Here's the correlation. Red is negative correlation. Purple and blue are positive correlation. And it's calculated for the period from 1950 to 2008. And then we did the same kind of experiment just using instrumental versus instrumental. Actually, we made a regional average within this white box, and we averaged all the gridded instrumental data into one time series, and we correlated it with each individual grid point, including the ones that were averaged together to make that time series in the first place. So, of course, it's better correlated. But you can see, hey, it's pretty good. The tree rings show, the strong positive correlation with soil moisture balance in central Mexico, despite the frequently flooded conditions. I forgot to mention, how come trees growing in water, can respond positively to precipitation? And I showed you in that thing at Black River that the correlation is positive. It's not, I would have thought it would be negative because it's already saturated. You'd think, but no, positive. And boy, that's the story throughout the Taxodium range. Whether mucronatum or disticum, it's positive correlation with growing season precipitation. And the reason it's a long story, but there's in these stagnant southern swamps, there's a downwater gradient in dissolved oxygen. The root system, the fine feeder root system tends to perch. It renders the plant vulnerable to root system dry down and internal moisture stress. There's high evapotranspiration demand on the plant. They can't keep up, and it's just flat out positive. And they respond positively to the flux of moisture and nutrient when it's raining a lot and it's driven through the root system. So that's what's going on in Amialco as well, and so we've made a 1,238 long chronology there near, in central Mexico. And we use that we calibrate this regional average in this box. So that's what I'm going to show you next. And here is the reconstruction of Mesoamerican megadrought. Where's my cursor? Reconstructed June PDSI 771 to 2008. It's the longest exactly dated annual climate reconstruction in Mesoamerica using the cypress from Amialco. And what you're looking at in red are the annual estimates of June PDSI. It's each year, including 1982-83 and 1997-98, the two great El Nino events in Mexico. Those were unmatched in the 1,000-year-long record. So the red is the annual values, and the black curve that you see in the time series is the multi-decadal variation. And of course, positive values on the June PDSI scale mean wetness, and negative values mean dryness. And and so we're calibrating 62% of the variance for this relatively short period, but that's the way it is in Mexico. There's not a lot of instrumental observations. And you can see, wow, there's some famous droughts that are up here in the highlands of Mexico. So the terminal classic drought had previously been known in the Mayan lowlands from lake sediment and speleothem data. And the tree rings show that it extended up into the highlands of central Mexico. Toltec drought, Aztec drought, and conquest era drought. So these are droughts that had significant, we think, socioeconomic consequences, some of them, these prolonged droughts. And we flat out know that the period of conquest was a disaster, for the native peoples of central Mexico. And so this is what's shown next. Mega drought and mega death in colonial Mexico. We published an article in Emerging Infectious Diseases a number of years ago. This is a painting by Diego Rivera in the National Palace, kind of showing the arrival of the Spanish, into Aztec Mexico. And the time series is the population level in central Mexico, which we don't know. We don't really know this, right? This is because it's dating from 1520, the arrival of Cortez, and it runs out past 1800, and it runs from nothing up to like maybe 22 million people. This is the population of central Mexico as estimated by historians and archaeologists. There's the high count and the low count, and kind of the mid-range count is what you're seeing here, published by Gerard in 1993. And there were these great demographic catastrophe that befell the native peoples in central Mexico with the arrival of the conquistadors. And we know for a fact that 1519, 1520 was indeed smallpox. 8 million people perish approximately. These are estimates, but we know it. We flat out know it. We found dead people, skeletons. I mean, this happened. It's reported in the historical record. The biggest one was in 1545, and 12 million, maybe 15 million people perish in central Mexico, mainly because that's where the highest population was. And it had the native Nahuatl name. It was Cocolitzli, which means lethal pestilence, and then there was another one when half of the remaining population perishes, maybe 2 million people in the Cocolitzli epidemic of 1576. So Cocolitzli is, we think, an indigenous hemorrhagic fever. And there were 12 of them during the colonial era. The two worst were the ones shown here in 1545 and 1576. And King Philip II sent his personal physician to Mexico, Dr. Francisco Hernandez, in the 1570s. And I mean, he was one of the most educated medical men in the world at the time. And he described the symptoms of Cocolitzli with clinical precision. And it follows no known European or African disease. It had the symptoms included high fever, acute headache, profuse bleeding from the ears, eyes, nose, and mouth. The black tongue, green urine, fear, insanity, and frequently death in 3 or 4 days. And death followed the social order of New Spain, the encomienda system of New Spain, which was their plantation system. And so the native peoples died preferentially, then the Indian African mestizo, then the Indian European mestizo, then the African, and then even Europeans perished in 16th century epidemics of Cocolitzli. And so we don't know the disease agent. It's not known. And this is kind of bedtime story, and one of the things is, one of the hypotheses is that, well, I think everyone agrees it's no known European or African diseases. There have been recent publications about salmonella being found in some skeletal remains, 10 of them, in fact, from this time period. No doubt they found that. But salmonella is not hemorrhagic. We don't know what this is. But one of the hypotheses, the one that Rodolfo favors, is that it was environmental amplification of a zoonotic disease. So the idea is a hemorrhagic disease hosted in a rodent reservoir, amplified and made epidemic by a sequence of climate extremes. So antecedent drought conditions, which is shown here. Drought 2 years before the epidemics. And this is based on all 12 cocoa leachly epidemics. This is like a composite map of all of them using the North American Seasonal Precipitation Atlas of winter precipitation. And then on the right is the summer moisture balance from the Mexican Drought Atlas, the MEXTA. And so wetness in central Mexico. So this antecedent drought impacted ecological conditions, created population bottleneck of infected rodents. They're crowding around the remnant water holes and food resources. They're infected. They spread disease amongst their diminished population. Conditions improve and they proliferate across the landscape, and they take disease with them and spread disease into human populations. And we've seen, hantavirus and seen nombre virus in New Mexico, 20 years ago or so. There's hantavirus kind of follows amplification like this. We have no proof that this happened, but the tree ring data kind of provides circumstantial support for the hypothesis. Take it or leave it. And then the last thing I'll talk about, tree rings in the Amazon. And so this is a map of tree ring chronologies from the International Tree Ring Data Bank. It's a public data bank. The pink triangles are the locations where we have tree ring chronology that are publicly available. There's been a few more since the map was made, but tree rings are decidedly a mid-latitude phenomenon, because they're very rare in the tropics. I mean, annual rings form under winter dormant conditions in particular. The tree goes dormant, and over evolutionary time, they've kind of shown a rhythmic anatomical formation of wood that we can recognize as tree rings. In the tropics, it's not quite like that. The trees, they don't really grow year round, but they don't really have this dormant season, except in a very few cases, especially where there's a dry season and there are deciduous tropical hardwoods. And so Cedrela odorata and Centraloa microchete, those are the only two species I know of in Amazonia that absolutely form annual rings and can be dated with dendrochronology and useful to get some age and are useful for climate reconstruction. This is ironic because there are 6,727 species already identified by science that are native to the lowland Amazon. They estimate maybe 10,000 more are there because they're so hyper diverse. They're so endemic. Many species only cover a few hectares. We know this because we have permanent study plots where we identify all the trees, and a whole bunch of these plots have trees that are found there, species that are found there, and they're not found on any other plots. And there's about 1,000 plots now in the lowland Amazon, if I'm remembering it right. So there are 73,000 tree species known on Earth. There are 3.04 trillion trees on Earth. 15 billion trees are cut every year. Maybe nearly half have been cut since the dawn of the civilization. Have you read this article in Nature in 2015? It's a cool article. I don't know how these are estimates, of course. So anyway, we're trying to build tropical chronologies. And in one of the most important and threatened ecosystems of the world, Amazonia. And we've had some success. We've made these Cedrela odorata chronology in the eastern equatorial Amazon. And here is a reconstruction starting in 1759. So it's about 250 years long. It ends in the sample year of 2016. And this is a calibrated reconstruction of wet season precipitation totals from this one location in the east. We have two chronologies there, and it's February through July precipitation totals, and this is in centimeters. So that's like, it's almost 3 meters of rain on average, well, it's 2.7 meters of rain, and, so there's the reconstruction in black with the 90%, prediction intervals in red, and the kind of black curve, the smoothness, the multi-decadal waveform, the singular spectrum analysis. Here's the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. And for our COVID project, when we could not go out in the field, we accessed the Brazilian Digital Library. So it's in Portuguese. So Daniela did this, and I did not. I don't speak Portuguese, but it's the accumulated intellectual product of the Republic of Brazil. And it's online searchable. I think there's 8 million documents in it. And so you can look up the word drought, seca, and you get all this avalanche of returns, including dried meat, dried fruit, dried this, dried that, and you got to filter it, and we did. It was a lot of work. And we found some incredible things. So what we're saying, we only explain 42% of the variance here, which is kind of low. It's not that great. But these extrema in the 19th century, if you can call them that, the highest values above the 90th percentile, they were floods on the big river itself. And these low ones, they were, in almost every case, they were big time droughts. And that's what I'm going to show you to end the talk. So this one, wait a minute. This one right here, where's the cursor at? Dang, God, this is terrible. Can you see that? And so that's the lowest value. That means drought, okay? And so it's known in the historical, we found this out later after doing all this work with the Brazilian Digital Library. It had a name way back in the early 20th century. It's called the Forgotten Drought of 1865. And so, wow. And so what you're looking at here is a map of South America, and there are historical reports, and the little cones are just telling you the number of reports that talk about wetness. If it's blue, it means reports about wetness in the newspaper and government document, wherever we found it. And if it is red, it means historical reports of drought. So they had a whole bunch here in the Noroeste province, northeastern province. And, and then the other thing you're seeing is our two tree ring chronologies in percentile form. So, I can't read it. Above the 90th percentile is the tallest cone with a little little star on top. So this is saying that, okay, the tree rings are super dry. They're in, below the 10th percentile, dry. And there's some dry reports in the northeastern province and even elsewhere in eastern Brazil at that time. Here's one, the Diario de Pernambuco, January 24th. The Vejante, which means low stand of the river, of 1864, 1865, is the lowest ever witnessed on the Rio Negro. This was reported at the time. Diario de Rio de Janeiro in September 65, the steamship Icamiaba grounded twice on the September trip. They were going to Tefe on the upper, and they couldn't make it. And so Louis Agassiz was there. So Louis Agassiz, of course, is a great, famous Harvard professor for which Glacial Lake Agassiz was named. He was, a polymath, really. And Silva Coutinho, who was the John Wesley Powell type figure of Brazil. He was a military man, a scientist, an engineer, amazing. They mounted the Thayer expedition, was an ichthyological expedition to the Amazon in 1865. And Coutinho writes that the river was maximum ebb here near Tabatinga. Large banks of sand and mud are discovered in the headlands, on the islands, and even in the middle of the river where inhabitants of villages are camped to fish. This is the English translations into English from Portuguese by my colleague who speaks English. So, I don't speak any Portuguese. So anyway, amazing. They were looking for freshwater fish species unknown to science. They found 800 of them. First time identified. That's more than was known to Carl Linnaeus in the entire world in the prior century. It's the hyperdiversity of the Amazonia. The conditions were ideal. It's like shooting fish into the barrel. The parts of the Amazon were ponded, they were trapped, and you can just grab them out of there. I mean, it's just amazing. And so it's called the Forgotten Drought also because cotton prices were high, because a bunch of irrational Southerners started the Civil War, to maintain their system of enforced labor, and cotton's kind of a drought tolerant plant compared to some that you could plant. And so they made bank. The Brazilian growers made bank. They were rich. The drought didn't bother them, so they kind of forgot about it. Thus the name, the Forgotten Drought. But it's arguably the worst drought of the historical era on the Amazon River itself. So say the treaters. Last slide. Well, the Amazon flood of 1859. This is Epoca. Quote, Santarém, the Amazon flood, covered all the lands and even was to harm some establishment built in lands of the mainland and very hot. And its invasion even went to towns like Santarém, where First Street was completely impassable, and now traffic can be made by canoe. Okay, so again, the cones are telling you there's Santarém, here's Manaus. I mean, there's a lot of reports of flooding, no doubt about it. Tree rings indicate wetness. So we went to Santorini and we got a survey crew here and we met, First Street is still there. And so we measured the elevation above sea level, of First Street, and it's 10.2 meters above mean sea level. The highest flood of the modern era in the instrumental record was in 2009, 10.22 meters. All right. And so, yeah, First Street's probably been built up a little bit. They had it built up then too, kind of. So there's uncertainty about the elevation of it, but you got to float a canoe on it too. And these aren't modern lightweight canoes. This is a big old dugout canoe from a tropical hardwood, just sits low in the water. I figured it must take at least 50 centimeters of water to float something like that. You could make an argument, which we did, that the flood of 1859 reached 10.7 meters above mean sea level. Well, that would make the Amazon flood of 1859 the most extreme in the recorded history of the Amazon River, even exceeding the recent extremes, which have become catastrophic. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't in the Amazon these days and in climate in general. What's happening is the extremes are getting amplified. So you have even more droughts and you have even more floods. It's crazy. And deforestation does not appear to be helping. It's increasing the flashiness of the greatest river in the world. So this could be the greatest flood in the history. There's another one, that's not the greatest one in our tree ring record. 1892 was another gargantuan one. It's a long article. We also make the argument that 1859, well, that's a candidate for the largest known meteorological flood in world history. Meteorological flood, meaning driven by climate, not the collapse of a glacial ice dam like glacial Lake Missoula, which, on the Clark's Fork, which then scoured all of eastern Washington state into the scablands. I mean, it's not a caldera collapse flood. It's a meteorological flood, may have been the largest in world history. How come? Because the mean flow of the Amazon River is 250,000 cubic meters a second in the modern record. That's greater than the combined flow of the next 6 largest rivers on Earth, two of which are tributaries, the Madeira and the Negro. So there cannot be a larger flood than an Amazon flood. And this may have been the largest Amazon flood in history. So tree rings can be very interesting. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you all for being here. And we have time for 2 questions, and then everyone will have to join the post-talk reception. But I also, before we have questions, I also want to thank Tara Nepper for organizing this event. So thank you so much, Tara. So if you have a global scale or local scale question, please come up and ask Dave Stahle at one of these.
You just shout, I can hear. I can hear. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'm teaching and researching here about the geospatial data science, and it is indeed a tree rings can be very interesting after your talk. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One is more about the technical, and another one is more non-technical. So regarding the technical questions, so there's a map that shows the correlation was different at each location. It shows some high correlation value at some regions, a low correlation value at other regions. From the geographer's perspective, that was very interesting to me. So I'm wondering if you can provide more explanation on that. So there's technical question. The non-technical question is, I want to know, if you do not mind, if you can share your secret recipe for becoming successful in your I'm a junior researcher, so I think if there's a simple recipe, I can follow it and become successful. 2 questions.
Well, the easy one first, do something you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And tree rings I studied archaeology. Archaeology is incredibly cool, not much future, and I learned about tree rings and man, it's just super interesting. Who doesn't love trees? We all love trees, and the stories they can tell is really amazing, and so these correlation maps that you're talking about. This is one. This is straight up correlation. There's 11,800 grid points on that map, and you can just make out the little bitty squares. And it's mapping is the correlation between our tree ring chronology here on the left, and every single grid point, 11,800 of them across the continent. And you can see that the positive correlations are in central Mexico. And as you go north into the United States, actually it switches negative. And it does that in the instrumental data too. There is this dipole structure to North American precipitation that's real. It's a feature of our climate over at the continental scale. And the tree rings, I mean, we wouldn't use the Amialco tree ring chronology to reconstruct, precipitation in Sacramento, California, but you could. And in fact, Ed's done it in Africa where we have very few chronologies. He's used tree ring data from all around the world and other kind of proxy data to make a sub-Saharan drought atlas without using any local data, but relying on these large-scale teleconnections, which have skill. It is, after all, the El Nino Southern Oscillation does drive the moisture balance in Eastern and Southern Africa. It does drive the moisture balance in central Mexico and in the southwestern United States, including the southeastern United States, probably not so much in Blacksburg. But down by the Gulf, it definitely has an effect. So there are these, these are called teleconnections in climate, correlations remotely. And something as gigantic as the El Nino Southern Oscillation perturbs the general circulation of the atmosphere and can result in downstream climate anomalies and can have value for season to year ahead forecasts of climate that are beneficial socioeconomically to society. And so tree rings have been used to reconstruct the El Nino Southern Oscillation, even though there's not a single tree that grows in the tropical Pacific. They grow on land only, and it is only through these remote interactions that we can do this. And so there's a great article by Ed and Mark Kane, who wrote the first numerical model of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, published last year in Geophysical Research Letters. I recommend it highly. Any other questions? Quickly. I think we're in a, not quickly. Don't you guys have a favorite tree or anything? Yes, ma'am.
Not be in person and take tree forward from. What is the most expressive one for you?
It's kind of like, which of your children do you love the most? I mean, it's hard to beat that dude right there. Me and Charles. I mean, that's BLK 227. This thing, we set out, I first went to Black River in 1985, and I'd called up North Carolina Heritage Program and asked, hey, you guys know where there's the old cypress in Virginia? And Julie Moore, she got with me, well, you might go. We think there might be some old trees down on Black River. And so we drive over the bridge there, and this is near Wilmington. And we're stopped the car right in the middle of the bridge, got out, and we're drooling. I mean, it was 1,000-year-old trees on both sides of the road. Unbelievable. We made a chronology that was 1,690 years long or something like that. And great. And then Nature Conservancy, wow, that's great. And they started buying land. And, wow, they made the Black River Preserve. I thought the problem was solved. And then Catherine Perkins Wolf came. She wanted to study cypress, and let's go back. And so we went back. And then we got to know, what we should do? We should try to document what's the oldest tree out here to help the Nature Conservancy try to raise money, raise interest. Because there's lots of them there. It's 22 miles long, at least. They have 20,000 acres now. And so we published an article. We went there with Charles's help, and we went and we cored trees looking for the oldest. And we cored that one. It was solid. It's 2,632 years old. And we published an article, and we had a press conference with Nature Conservancy out on the river. We took the press out on the river in kayaks, and and we're deliberately pandering to the news because you got to. And if you look at, Google citations of Black River, North Carolina, there was like 5 order of magnitude increase in references to Black River, North Carolina on the day the thing was published. And the next day it collapsed. You know, after 3 days, there was no thought of it whatsoever by humanity. You have a limited window to focus attention on the most important thing we have to do is to save each other and to save life on Earth. And so that's deliberate. That's exactly why we did it. And finding this great tree, that's one of the great experiences of my life. But I have other favorites too. Thank you for the question.
To you gentlemen back there that ask how you get to a point that he gets to, probably you can't. But I've worked with him in there. It took us 8 years for him to find that. But this gentleman here, his students that are around him get doted upon like you would not believe. They have nicknames like Spithead, Gin and Tonic, Napalm. This gentleman is called Deadwood, but he takes care of his people. He loves his students. He loves his friends. It's incredible. He's a beaver in the woods, never stops until it's done, and really tight in his work. I'm just the guide, furnish the boats, and I'm the cook. So it's been a pleasure working with him, but he dotes on his people seriously.